I was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking a coffee that had already cooled, when the cell phone vibrated. It wasn't a time for messages, not of that kind. My son always called. My daughter-in-law sent short and too polite messages. That notification, however, looked different before I even read it. A heavy presentiment crossed my chest, one of those that cannot be explained, they only feel. I opened the message slowly, as if time could protect me from what was coming. The words appeared on the screen with a coldness that did not match an ordinary request. My day changed there, before I even understood why. You need to see it with your own eyes. That sentence alone would be enough to put me on alert. It didn't say what it was or why I needed to see it. It continued, but come alone, and do not warn your son or your daughter-in-law. My heart raced in a strange, almost childlike way, as if I was about to do something wrong. Anyone who asks for secrecy like this is not thinking about anyone's good. The message didn't sound like care, it sounded like warning that something had already gone out of my control. And deep down, I knew that the silence required had a price. I stared at the screen for long minutes, rereading each word, trying to find some less threatening meaning. I thought about ignoring it, pretending I hadn't seen it. I thought about calling my son, telling him everything, asking for explanations. But something inside me said that this was exactly what they didn't want me to do. And this realization hurt more than the message itself. Realizing that someone was trying to keep me away from my own family lit up a wake-up call that I had never felt before. It wasn't pure fear. It was the feeling of being pushed out of one's own life. I've always been seen as fragile since my husband died. Not because I had changed, but because others decided that I needed to be taken care of. Gradually, they began to speak for me, decide for me, organize things that I never asked for help to organize. At the time, I thought it was poorly expressed love. Today, looking at that message, I understood that maybe it was something else. Perhaps my fragility was too convenient. Perhaps my loneliness had been observed, measured, and used against me. This thought made me close my eyes for a moment, trying to catch my breath. I got up from the chair with my legs slightly shaky and went to the bedroom to change my clothes. Every simple gesture felt heavier than usual. While buttoning my blouse, I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who did not recognize herself in that situation. I wasn't confused, I wasn't incapable, I wasn't invisible. But they were treating me as if I were. And that message was proof that something was being done behind my back. For the first time, I felt that my safety was not guaranteed, neither emotionally nor in any other way. The journey to the marked place seemed longer than it really was. Every traffic light, every corner increased my restlessness. My mind worked nonstop, creating scenarios, justifications, possible excuses. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding. Maybe someone wanted to warn me about something my son didn't know yet. I clung to these hypotheses because the alternative was too hard to accept. Accepting that the people I loved most might be involved in something against me required a strength I didn't yet know I had. Even so, I continued driving. When I arrived, the silence immediately bothered me. It was not a quiet silence. It was a tense silence, full of wrong pauses. Before I even entered, I heard muffled voices, conversations that ceased as soon as I opened the door. That abrupt interruption made me feel like an intruder in my own environment. The smiles that followed were too fast, too rehearsed. No one seemed really surprised by my presence, just uncomfortable. My stomach turned, and I knew I wasn't there by chance. I greeted everyone, trying to keep my voice steady, but I felt that something had already been broken. Glances were averted, hands hid papers, folders were closed in a hurry. It was like walking into a scene that had been interrupted seconds before the finale. I noticed too many details for someone who was supposed to be there just for a casual conversation. Every gesture denounced urgency. Every silence screamed guilt. No one explained anything to me. No one took the initiative to say why I had been called. And this absence of explanations spoke louder than any words. I sat slowly, feeling the weight of exclusion fall on me like a cold blanket. For the first time, I understood that there were decisions being made away from me, about me. This was not a family reunion. It was an operation, and I wasn't part of it. My name was there, my life was there, but my voice had been taken out of the equation. I felt a mixture of shame and indignation that burned me inside. Shame for realizing how much I was underestimated. Indignation for still trying to disguise this as care. I tried to start a conversation, ask simple questions, but the answers came short, mismatched, poorly fitted. The versions did not match. Each person said something slightly different, as if they hadn't agreed on the story properly. That gave me more clarity than comfort. Lies never hold up when they need to be repeated. I could feel like I was touching something that they preferred to keep buried. And the more I watched, the more evident it became that this plan had not begun that day. It was then that I realized the request for me to come alone was not to protect me. It was to isolate me, to prevent me from reacting early, from asking for help, from questioning out loud. They wanted to catch me off guard, weak, confused. They wanted me to accept whatever came, as I had accepted so many little things before. This realization fell on me like an electric shock. Something inside me began to move, still shy but alive. Maybe they still saw me as fragile, but I no longer felt totally broken. At that moment, I still didn't know exactly what was at stake. I didn't know the extent of the plan, nor the real risks I was taking. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. That message had been the beginning of a silent war. And like it or not, I was inside her. I left that meeting with a heavy heart, but with my eyes open. Something had been awakened in me that day. And without even realizing it, I had taken the first step to stop being just the woman they underestimated. The fact that you chose to stay here listening to this story says a lot about who you are. What follows isn't just something I've lived. It's a truth that many people face in silence, within their own family. If you believe that stories like this deserve to continue being told, subscribe to the channel, because each subscription is what keeps these voices alive. I entered that house with the strange feeling of invading a space that had always been mine. Nothing had changed physically since the last time I was there, but everything seemed out of place, as if the air was heavier. The familiar smell no longer brought comfort. There was something wrong with the way the furniture was arranged, in the haste with which they closed the door behind me, as if they wanted to contain something. My heart was pounding, and I had to take a deep breath so as not to show how disconcerted I was. I still wanted to believe that it was all just an exaggeration in my head. The first few minutes were too uncomfortable to ignore. People spoke little and moved a lot, like actors who forgot the text. Gazes crossed the room in silence, asking for confirmation, approval, or caution. When I got closer, the conversations died in the middle of the sentence. It was impossible not to notice. That was no coincidence, it was standard. I felt invisible and watched at the same time, as if my presence was tolerated but unwanted. For the first time, I felt ashamed to be there, as if I were a problem to be managed. I sat on the couch trying to appear calm, but my hands gave away the tension. I pressed my fingers together, an old gesture I made when I needed to stand my ground. No one sat next to me. They kept a careful distance, almost too respectful. This distance screamed more than any confrontation. It was the space that is created when someone has already made a decision and fears being questioned. I was only there to perform a ritual, not to really participate. While they pretended normality, I began to observe more closely. Folders on the table stacked in a disorganized way, but clearly important. Papers partially hidden under a magazine, as if someone had acted too quickly. An open notebook, hastily turned off as I approached. Every detail added to a growing sense of exclusion. I knew that house. I knew those people. And precisely because of that, I knew that something serious was being hidden from me. I tried to start a conversation, ask about banal subjects, but the answers came short, evasive, almost automatic. It was like talking to someone who was no longer present. My son avoided looking at me directly, and it cut me deeper than any harsh words. The daughter-in-law kept a rigid, polite, calculated smile. There was no heat there, just control. I felt small, diminished, as if my presence was just a temporary nuisance on a larger plane. The silence between one sentence and another began to suffocate me. It was a silence full of meanings, loaded with secrets. I realized that no one was willing to explain anything to me spontaneously. If I wanted answers, I would have to get them. And this realization brought me deep sadness. I never imagined that the day would come when I would need to beg for clarity within my own family. That house, which had once been a place of noisy meetings and laughter, now seemed like a silent courtroom. I got up to go to the kitchen, more out of a need to escape that atmosphere than out of thirst. As I walked, I heard a whisper behind me, interrupted the next instant. They pretended that nothing had happened. This small gesture was like a brutal confirmation. They were talking about me. They were deciding something about me. My stomach turned, and I felt a chill rise down my spine. For the first time, I thought that maybe I was at real risk, not just emotional. In the kitchen, I leaned against the sink and took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. I remembered how many times I accepted other people's decisions without question, trusting that they knew what they were doing. I remembered how I got used to being included only at the end, when everything was already resolved. Perhaps that was just the logical consequence of years of silence on my part. This idea hurt, but it also ignited something new, a restlessness that was no longer just fear, but indignation. When I returned to the living room, I felt that the atmosphere had become even more tense. It was as if my brief absence had been used to adjust something, to hide better, to align versions. I sat down again, now with my senses even more attentive. Every gesture, every pause, every breath seemed loaded with intention. I could no longer fool myself by saying that it was just an impression. The truth was there, spread throughout the room, waiting for me to have the courage to see it. It was at that moment that I realized how much I was being underestimated. They thought I didn't notice, that I didn't connect the dots, that I accepted everything without question. This realization moved me in an unexpected way. I didn't just feel hurt, I felt angry. A silent, contained, but powerful anger. Maybe they still saw me as fragile, but something inside me was starting to harden. I still didn't know how or when, but I knew that I wouldn't get out of that situation the same way I did. As the forced conversation continued, I realized that that silence was a weapon, a way to confuse me, to get tired, to make me give up. But instead, he woke me up. I left that house with the clear feeling that something much bigger was at stake. And even though I didn't have all the answers, I made a silent promise to myself. I would no longer be just the woman who listens. I would become the woman who observes, understands, and acts. They started talking to me as if I were a tired child. The sentences came slowly, measured, chosen with excessive care, as if any wrong word could confuse me. "We just want to help," they said. "You walk so alone. It's a lot of responsibility for you." I listened to everything in silence, feeling each sentence weigh more than the last. There were no questions, only affirmations. They didn't want to know what I thought, just convince me of what they had already decided. My son avoided my gaze, concentrating on arranging something non-existent on the table. The daughter-in-law assumed the speech with frightening naturalness, as if she had rehearsed that speech in front of the mirror. He spoke of security, of the future, of tranquility. Beautiful, hollow words, used to cover up something much harder. The more she spoke, the more I felt like they were trying to fit me into a narrative that wasn't mine. I didn't recognize myself in that fragile woman they described. When I tried to interrupt, saying that I was fine, that I had been minding my own business for years, I was gently cut off. "We know, Mom, but things change," my son replied with a tense smile. The way he said "things change" sounded like a sentence. It was not an observation, it was a warning. I felt the ground move under my feet. It was as if they were preparing the ground for something that I still didn't see completely, but could already feel. They began to cite small, banal, out-of-context episodes. A day when I forgot to return a call, a bill paid late, a rescheduled medical appointment. Every detail was used as proof that I needed help. I listened in disbelief, trying to remember if it really happened that way. For the first time, I felt doubt about my own memory, and that scared me more than any direct accusation. The feeling of being pushed to a place I didn't choose made me swallow hard. It was humiliating to have to justify my lucidity. It was humbling to realize that my entire story was being reduced to carefully selected small lapses. They talked as if they were doing me a favor, when in fact they were robbing me of something essential: my autonomy, my voice, my right to decide. I tried to change the tone of the conversation, bring back memories, create an emotional bridge. I talked about their father, how we faced difficulties together, how I always managed my life, but I realized that this did not move them. It was as if the past had lost value in the face of a larger plan. A cold, rational plan, where feelings got in the way. At that moment, I felt a strange grief, not for the loss of someone, but for the loss of the relationship that I thought existed. The more they insisted that everything was for my good, the clearer it became that my good was not a priority. Their good does. The convenience, the control, the perfect organization of a life where I took up less and less space. That phrase began to echo in my head in an almost cruel way. "It's for your good." I had never heard anything so far from care and so close to threat. My body reacted before I could even organize my thoughts. The cold hands, the tight chest, a slight dizziness that I had to disguise. Perhaps they interpreted any physical sign as confirmation of the narrative they were constructing. So I forced myself to take a deep breath, to maintain my posture. I couldn't afford to look weak at that moment. Not yet. Even without understanding everything, I knew that I needed to observe more than talk. In the midst of that suffocating conversation, I realized something important. They weren't improvising. There was an order, a logic, a clear sequence in what they said. One followed the other without contradicting each other, as if each answer was already ready. It chilled me inside. Nobody puts together a speech like this all of a sudden. That had been thought about, adjusted, repeated. The realization that that plan was not recent left me breathless. I pretended to agree at times, just with my head, just enough for them to continue talking. The more they felt safe, the more they missed details. Vague dates, meetings mentioned in passing, people involved that I didn't know. Every word was a clue. I was no longer just a confused woman listening. I was gathering information. Even though I didn't know exactly how I would use it, I felt something change inside me. I came out of that conversation emotionally exhausted, but awake. The humiliation still hurt, the betrayal was still hard to name, but something had changed. I realized that if I kept trusting blindly, I would lose much more than comfort. I would lose myself. At that moment, even silently, I decided that I would not allow it. Maybe they still thought I didn't understand, but I was starting to understand everything. When I finally got up to leave, no one tried to stop me. They just repeated that they were there for me, that everything would be resolved soon. I nodded, with a tired smile. Inside, however, I knew that nothing was resolved. On the contrary, that had only been the confirmation that something very serious was afoot. And for the first time since it all began, I felt I needed to act, even if I didn't know how yet. When everyone dispersed around the house, I felt that this was my only chance to understand what was happening. It wasn't a brave decision. It was pure instinct. Something inside me said that if I left without looking around, I would miss the only opportunity to see the truth. I walked slowly, as if I didn't want to attract attention, pretending to look for the bathroom. Each step seemed to echo too loudly in my ear. My heart beat strongly, not with guilt, but with urgency. I passed through the room again and my eyes went straight to the table. The folders were still there, now slightly apart, as if someone had tried to organize too quickly. I approached carefully, feeling a chill run through my arms. I touched the edge of one of them, hesitated for a second, and then opened it. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, he just knew he needed to look. The paper was there, right at the top, as if it had been forgotten in the hurry. It only took a quick reading for the floor to disappear under my feet. The words guardianship, incapacity, and administration of assets jumped out before my eyes. I read and reread it, hoping that my mind was playing a trick on me. It wasn't. My name appeared there, printed in a cold, technical, distant way. It was as if I was reading about someone else, someone I didn't know, someone who didn't have a voice. I felt a heat rise up my face, followed by nausea that forced me to hold on to the table so as not to fall. That was not a future conversation. It was a plan in progress. I closed the briefcase quickly when I heard footsteps approaching. My body reacted before the thought. The fear of being caught tampering with it crossed me, but it was less than the indignation that grew inside me. I sat back down, trying to keep my face neutral, while my mind spun nonstop. Everything started to make sense in a cruel way. The rehearsed lines, the condescending tone, the request for me to come alone. They weren't just talking. I was preparing to be taken from my own life. While they pretended normality, I no longer heard the words, only what they hid. Every phrase of caution now sounded like a threat. Each smile felt like an attempt to keep me calm until it was too late. I felt a mixture of anger and sadness so intense that I had to bite the inside of my cheek so I wouldn't cry right there. That wasn't just an emotional betrayal. It was a real attempt to erase me legally, to turn me into someone incapable in the eyes of the world. The most painful thing was not the role itself, but realizing how long it must have been planned. Nothing there seemed improvised. Dates, specific terms, references to medical evaluations that I never did. Everything indicated preparation, patience, coolness. I thought about how many times I trusted, how many times I signed documents without reading them carefully, how many meetings I stopped going because they told me it wasn't necessary. Each memory now came loaded with a new meaning, and it cut me inside. I stood up again, this time with the certainty that I could not show anything. If they realized that I had seen that document, they could speed up the process. She needed to leave there maintaining the image they expected, the confused, tired, docile woman. This realization embarrassed me, but it also gave me clarity. If they wanted to underestimate me, I would use that to my advantage. I swallowed my tears, straightened my shoulders, and walked back into the room with calculated steps. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, empty and forced. I nodded, answered little, observed a lot. Every word spoken confirmed what I had seen. They talked about deadlines, about solving it soon, about avoiding wear and tear. They didn't talk about me as a person, but as a problem. That hardened something inside my chest. The pain was still there, but it was beginning to mix with determination. I was no longer just the victim of that situation. I was the only one who knew exactly what was at stake. When I finally said goodbye, no one tried to walk me to the door. I found it curious how relieved they seemed to be with my departure. Perhaps they believed that everything had gone according to plan. Maybe they thought I hadn't seen anything, understood nothing. I got into the car with shaky hands, took a deep breath, and closed my eyes for a few seconds. The image of that paper did not leave my mind. My name, my life, reduced to cold legal terms. On the way back, reality imposed itself in full force. I was in danger. Not physical, perhaps, but cool, emotional, existential. If that plan went ahead, I would lose my house, my money, my decisions. I would lose my identity. This awareness was like a punch in the stomach, but also like a call. Something needed to change. And fast. I still didn't know how or who I could count on, but he knew with absolute certainty that he could no longer remain silent. When I parked at home, I remained a few minutes inside the car, looking at my own hands. The same hands that raised a child, that supported a family, that were now considered incapable. I felt tears flow, not of weakness, but of revolt. That night marked the end of a naivety that I had carried for years, and without fully realizing it, it was there that I began to stop being just the betrayed woman. It was there that I began to prepare to fight. That night, I hardly slept. Lying in bed, I relived every detail of the day as if I were trapped in a cycle that didn't end. The sentences, the looks, the paper inside the briefcase, everything came back with a cruel clarity. I tried to convince myself that maybe I was exaggerating, that maybe there was a less serious explanation. But fear is not born out of nowhere. It grows when intuition recognizes a real danger, even though the mind struggles to accept it. I got up before dawn and walked around the house in silence. I ran my hand over the furniture, the old photos, the objects that told my story, all that has always been my refuge, my safe territory. For the first time, however, I felt that I could lose everything without even being consulted. The idea of someone deciding my future while I was still lucid and conscious took my breath away. It was not only the material loss that scared me, but the possibility of being treated as someone who no longer exists. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that I could barely drink. My mind began to connect dots that had previously seemed too loose to form a clear drawing. Small attitudes of the recent past have gained new weight. Insistent suggestions for me to sell the house, comments on my memory, the rush to organize my finances. All of this, which I had accepted as a concern, now felt like part of a carefully written script. The doubt began to turn into something heavier. What if they had already advanced more than I imagined? What if other people were already involved? Lawyers, doctors, bank employees? The feeling of being surrounded by invisible decisions made me feel small, vulnerable. For the first time, I considered the real possibility of waking up one day to find that my life no longer belonged to me. That thought made my hands sweat and my heart race. I tried to remember when I started to be left out. There was no exact moment, just a gradual, almost imperceptible withdrawal. First, unnecessary meetings, then too summarized information, until, without realizing it, I no longer participated in anything important. This awareness hurt deeply. Not out of naivety, but because I realized how love can be used to numb distrust. I trusted because I loved it, and this was being used against me. Fear then ceased to be abstract. It took shape. Home, money, autonomy, my name on a document that I did not authorize. It was not paranoia, it was a concrete possibility. I felt it in my body, in the constant tightness in my chest, in the difficulty of taking a deep breath. Every time the phone rang, my heart raced. I became suspicious of even the most banal conversations. Everything seemed to carry a second meaning, a hidden intention. Even so, a part of me still resisted the idea that my own son was capable of something like that. This internal struggle consumed me. I wanted to believe that there was a mistake, a serious misunderstanding, something that could be clarified with an honest conversation. But another part, quieter and perhaps wiser, already knew that it was not confusion. It was about control. And control is not easily negotiated. It was in this conflict that I realized how alone I was. There was no one there to tell me what to do, no one to validate my fears. And at the same time, this loneliness began to produce something unexpected. If I was alone, I was also free to think, observe, and decide. For the first time since it all started, I felt like I needed to stop reacting and start acting, still not knowing how, but with the certainty that time was against me. I opened an old drawer and started looking for my documents. Deeds, contracts, papers that I myself had kept over the years. Each leaf found was a small anchor in reality. I existed. I had built all that, and no one could just erase it without resistance. That simple, almost domestic search began to give me back something I thought I had lost: clarity. As I separated the papers, I noticed that my breathing was firmer. The fear was still there, but now it shared space with another sensation: surveillance, attention. I was no longer just the scared woman trying to figure out what was going on. I was preparing, albeit instinctively. That doubt that had been eating away at me was turning into an alert, and the alert I knew could be the first step to survival. When the sun finally came through the window, illuminating the desk full of documents, I felt a deep tiredness, but I also felt something new, a kind of silent decision. I would not allow my future to be decided in closed rooms, with hidden roles and interrupted voices. I still didn't know who could help me, nor how far that betrayal went. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty, that fear had woken me up, and I wouldn't go back to sleep as long as my life was at risk. In the days that followed, I began to notice a pattern that I had previously not had the courage to name. Every time I touched on the subject, even lightly, the reaction came quickly and coordinated. They said I was tired, too sensitive, confusing things. The way they spoke to me was always soft, almost sweet, but charged with a condescension that diminished me. They didn't attack me directly. They did something worse. They made me doubt myself. When I mentioned that I had seen strange documents on the table that day, my son laughed. A short, nervous laugh. He said I must be mixing old papers with current things. The daughter-in-law added in a worried tone that I had been very anxious since I was alone. That word, anxious, was thrown around as a diagnosis. Not as empathy, but as a convenient explanation for everything I felt. It was as if any perception of mine could be invalidated with an emotional label. I began to mentally review my own memories, as if I were being interrogated from within. Had I read it wrong? Did I exaggerate the importance of that role? This constant self-questioning began to wear me down. I felt tired, confused, just as they described it, and that terrified me, because I realized how efficient that strategy was. They didn't need to prove anything to me. It was enough to make me distrust myself. In some calls, my son suggested that I see a doctor, just in case. I said it would be good to have someone evaluate my memory, my mood, my behavior. The casual way he talked about it chilled my blood. It was not a counsel, it was a movement, a logical step into something bigger. Each suggestion came disguised as caution, but it carried an implicit threat. If I disagreed, I would confirm their narrative. If he accepted, he would hand over another gun. I began to pay attention to the tone, not just the words. Whenever I showed firmness, they looked at each other. Whenever I hesitated, they advanced a little further. It was a silent, psychological game, and I had been put into it without consent. The realization of this brought me deep sadness. It was not only the betrayal itself, but the cruelty of the method. They didn't just want to decide for me. They wanted me to believe that I needed it. There was a moment when I almost gave in. One particularly difficult day, when I woke up confused from so much thinking, I considered calling and saying that they were right, that maybe I really needed help. Loneliness weighs more when one is being discredited. But something stopped me. Maybe pride, maybe survival, perhaps the clear memory of who I had always been before they began to reduce me to a fragile and convenient version. I started to write things down in a notebook. Dates, exact phrases, subtle changes in behavior. At first, it seemed like an exaggeration, but I soon realized that it helped me keep the ground under my feet. When doubt arose, I reread my own notes. There were the contradictions, the repeated details, the invisible script. That gave me back confidence. It wasn't crazy. It was standard, and patterns can be disassembled. The more I observed, the clearer the strategy became. They wanted to tire me out, confuse me, make me give up questioning. Gaslighting did not come as aggression, but as a gentle, daily, corrosive insistence. And I felt the impact of that on my body. Headaches, insomnia, a constant knot in the stomach. My body reacted to the silent violence that my mind was beginning to understand. Despite this, something has changed inside me. With each attempt by them to diminish me, I became more attentive, more careful. I learned to talk less and listen more. Not to react immediately, to be saved. That woman they called confused was actually getting more strategic. I still felt fear, but I was no longer paralyzed by it. Fear had become a focus. I realized then that they counted on my emotional fragility to win, but they didn't count on my ability to learn quickly. I might have looked shaken, but I was awake as never before. Each conversation became a collection of data. Each attempt to discredit me became silent proof that something very wrong was happening. And little by little, I began to understand that surviving that would require not immediate confrontation, but intelligence. At that stage, I accepted a hard truth. I couldn't rely on them to protect me. If I wanted to maintain my autonomy, I would need to act cautiously and coldly, even if it meant swallowing the pain for a while longer. It was not weakness. It was strategy. And for the first time since the beginning of everything, I felt like I had a choice. Even in the midst of the manipulation, I still owned my mind. And that, I knew, was something they hadn't been able to get out of me yet. It was almost by chance that I found someone willing to listen to me without interrupting me. It was not a planned search nor a direct request for help. It happened in a simple conversation, one of those that start without pretense and end up changing everything. I was tired of keeping everything alone, tired of doubting my own perception. When I started talking, I was carefully, choosing each word, testing the ground. I didn't want to seem exaggerated. I didn't want to confirm the fragile image they had created of me. This person didn't correct me, didn't rush me, didn't try to find more comfortable explanations. He just listened. And that simple gesture had a profound effect. For the first time in weeks, I felt like my voice was heavy again. I told him about the message, about the documents, about the strange conversations, and the constant tone of distrust in relation to my lucidity. As I spoke, I realized something important. My narrative made sense. There was logic, sequence, coherence. Nothing I said seemed confusing or delirious. The unlikely ally, someone who knew my family from afar but wasn't emotionally involved, asked pointed questions. Not questions that put me in doubt, but that sought clarity. Dates, names, specific situations. That helped me organize my thoughts. Each answer I gave reinforced the certainty that it was not about imagination. There were facts. And facts don't disappear just because someone insists you're wrong. When I mentioned the documents on guardianship, I saw this person's countenance change. Not of exaggerated astonishment, but of real attention. It was there that I felt, for the first time, that maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. I was given a simple, almost obvious guideline that no one in my family had given me. I needed to protect my interests immediately. Not emotionally, but legally. That word, legally, echoed within me with force. I left that conversation with a mixture of relief and fear. Relief for finally being validated. Fear for realizing the real gravity of the situation. What once seemed just an emotional betrayal was now designed as a concrete, structured threat, moving forward in time. But there was something new accompanying this fear. Direction. For the first time, I had a next step, albeit a small one, and that made all the difference. I began to understand that asking for help was not a sign of weakness, but of intelligence. My ally did not promise miracles nor quick fixes. He promised clarity. And clarity, at that moment, was all I needed. I started to gather information with more method. I reviewed old documents, organized dates, separated what was supposition from what was fact. That external organization reflected something that was also happening inside me. The most curious thing was to realize how my posture began to change naturally. I spoke less with my family, but I observed more. He responded calmly, without unnecessary confrontations. They seemed more secure, perhaps believing that the strategy was working. Little did they know that every word spoken was now filtered, recorded, analyzed. The woman they thought was confused was actually becoming more and more conscious. My ally alerted me to something I hadn't yet considered in depth. If the plan had existed for years, other steps could already be underway. Bills, signatures, powers of attorney. It made me feel bitterly cold, but it also reinforced the urgency. There was no more room for hesitation. I needed to act before I reached a point of no return. And this time, I wasn't reacting on impulse, but by strategy. I came to understand that this fight would not be won with emotional outbursts or direct accusations. It would be overcome with patience, preparation, and calculated silence. This required a kind of strength that I was still learning to access. Not the force of immediate confrontation, but the force of intelligent resistance. That realization transformed me profoundly. I no longer saw myself as just a victim of an unjust situation, but as someone capable of getting through it. That night, when I got home, I sat alone in the living room in silence. For the first time in a long time, silence did not suffocate me. He gave me space to think, plan, breathe. I was still hurt, betrayed, vulnerable, but now I had something I didn't have before: external support and renewed confidence in my own lucidity. That changed everything. The silent war continued, but I was no longer disarmed. And it was there, in that simple and discreet moment, that I realized the real beginning of my transformation. I still looked like the fragile woman they saw, but inside, something was solidifying. I didn't know exactly when or how it would all come to light. I only knew that from then on, my every step would be conscious. And, like it or not, I was preparing for the confrontation to come. It was with the help of my ally that I began to see the real size of what I was facing. Until then, I had dealt with fragments, loose phrases, suspicious documents, strange attitudes. But as we got everything in order, a timeline began to form, and she pointed to a place that hurt me more than anything else. That hadn't started now. It had started when I was most vulnerable. Soon after my husband's death, I could barely get out of bed. It worked on automatic. trusting the people around me to take care of what I didn't have the strength to face. It was during this period that I signed papers without reading them carefully, accepted help that I did not ask for, let others take on tasks that had always been mine. At the time, I thought it was support. Now she was beginning to realize that this grief had been the perfect ground for something much darker. We found records of meetings that I never attended, dates that coincided with difficult birthdays, holidays when I was isolated, times when I clearly didn't have the emotional conditions to question anything. Each discovery was accompanied by a tightness in the chest. It was not just a recent betrayal. It was a slow, patient, almost meticulous construction. They waited for the right moment, and it made me feel used in a deeply painful way. There were documents that mentioned planned changes in the management of my assets years ago, preemptive suggestions, future evaluations, clauses that presupposed my incapacity even before any real sign of it. That made me nauseous. It was not just a plan for the present. It was a long-term project, designed while I believed I was being supported. The feeling of having lived on a silent lie for so long took my breath away. The most devastating thing was to realize that none of it was done in a hurry. Everything had been thought out calmly, revised, adjusted. There was a coldness there that I never associated with my own son. I always believed him to be impulsive, emotional, but that plan required discipline, persistence, total absence of guilt. This forced me to face a truth that I had been avoiding. I no longer knew that person. Perhaps I had never known it completely. Each new piece of information rewrote my recent past. Conversations that once seemed innocent now sounded rehearsed. Advice gained tones of manipulation. I remembered how many times I heard that I didn't have to worry, that someone was already taking care of it. Those phrases, which once brought me relief, now echoed like ignored warnings. I had been too gentle with the silence, and silence had been used against me. There was a moment when I had to stop the investigation. I felt a physical pain in my chest, a pressure that forced me to sit down and breathe slowly. Facing that truth required emotional strength that I was still learning to access. It was not easy to accept that people you love are capable of such coldness. I cried there, not of despair, but of mourning. I mourn for the family I thought I had. I fight for the confidence that would not return. My ally didn't try to minimize anything. He just stayed there, present. This once again helped me keep my feet on the ground. There was no more room for comforting illusions. The truth was exposed, raw, hard. But paradoxically, it also gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time: firmness. Knowing what I was dealing with gave me back a sense of control. The unknown scares more than clear pain. From that moment on, I understood that I was not only fighting for the present, but for everything that had been quietly stolen from me over the years. My autonomy, my voice, my choices. This awareness ignited something inside me that wasn't just indignation. It was determination. It didn't matter how old that plan was. I was still there, lucid, capable, and willing to prevent it from coming to an end. I returned home that night with the weight of truth on my shoulders, but also with a new clarity. I was no longer just someone reacting to recent events. I was digging up a story that had been written without my consent, and in doing so, he was recovering something essential: my narrative. They had planned everything thinking I would never notice. That was their mistake. As I arranged the papers on the table, I felt that a phase had ended. The phase of doubt, of confusion, of the attempt to justify the unjustifiable. Now I knew exactly what I was fighting against. And even though the road ahead was difficult, I no longer walked in the dark. The truth, painful as it was, had armed me, and I was ready for the next step. After everything I discovered, my first impulse was to confront, to call, to demand explanations, to throw the truth on the table. But it was enough to talk once again with my ally to understand that this would be exactly what they expected: an emotional, disorganized, easy-to-use confrontation against me. For the first time, I had to accept a harsh idea. To survive that, I would have to pretend fragility, feigning confusion, pretend to agree. Not because I was weak, but because I needed to buy time. I started to measure every word when I spoke to my son and daughter-in-law. He answered in short sentences, agreed with superficial suggestions, avoided direct questions. Inside, it corroded me. I have always been a frank, direct person. That performance went against everything I believed it to be. But every time I saw the relief in their eyes, I understood that it was working. They let their guard down. And that, at that moment, was a precious advantage. I began to realize how my image as a confused woman made things easier for them. They talked more than they should, explained more than necessary, thinking that I was not understanding properly. Instead of correcting, I listened. Instead of reacting, I kept it. It was strange how the role they imposed on me ended up becoming a tool. That caused me shame, yes, but it also gave me access to information that they would never have revealed if they saw me as a threat. There were days when I had to leave the room to cry alone. Pretending is tiring. Pretending hurts. Pretending requires enormous emotional restraint. But every time I thought about giving up, I remembered the paper inside the folder, my name printed as if I were incapable. That image pushed me forward. I wasn't faking it out of pride. I was pretending to protect my life as I knew it. I began to accept meetings and conversations that I would have avoided before. The more I seemed docile, the more confident they became. They talked about deadlines, about getting everything done soon, about future tranquility. I nodded, inside counting the days, the details, the contradictions. Each conversation was one more piece in the puzzle. I no longer felt like I was just reacting. He was driving something, even if silently. At the same time, I continued to gather evidence. He organized documents at night, made detailed notes, recorded exact dates and phrases. My notebook became a kind of anchor. Whenever doubt threatened to return, I reread everything I had written. It reminded me that my lucidity was not at stake. What was at stake was my patience, and I was learning how to use it as a weapon. Interestingly, the more I feigned fragility, the stronger I felt inside. It was not an explosive, visible force. It was something solid, silent, difficult to break. I began to see that phase as a crossing, not permanent, but necessary. I had to cross that minefield without alerting those who had built it. This required coolness, something I never imagined I would need to use against my own family. There were times when I wondered if I was becoming someone I didn't recognize, if that strategy wasn't hardening me too much. But whenever this doubt arose, I remembered the final goal. It was not revenge. It was survival. It was dignity. I didn't want to destroy anyone. I just wanted to prevent them from destroying me. This clarity helped me move forward without losing myself. I also realized that pretending did not mean accepting. It meant choosing the right moment. I wasn't retreating. I was positioning myself. Every silence of mine had an intention. Each apparent agreement was calculated. That gave me back a sense of control that I hadn't felt in a long time. Even though I was underestimated, I was active. Even though I was in disbelief, I was building something. At the end of that phase, something became clear to me. They believed they had won, that I was too tired to fight, too confused to react. This false security was their biggest mistake. I still looked like the same fragile woman as before, but inside, I was no longer that person. The victim was staying behind. In her place, someone more attentive, more strategic, more difficult to take down began to emerge. And as they moved forward with confidence, I prepared myself in silence. He knew that time was narrowing, that soon I would have to get out of that role and show myself in full. But not yet. It was not yet time. Pretending at that moment was not cowardice. It was survival. And I was determined to get through that phase alive, whole and ready for the coming confrontation. I started to treat each day as an opportunity for collection. Nothing was too small to ignore. A sentence said too quickly, a comment made unintentionally, an email sent in the wrong tone. Everything had value. I no longer relied on memory alone. He trusted the record. He wrote down times, exact words, changes in behavior. That gave me security. It was as if, with each note, I reaffirmed to myself that I was seeing everything clearly. I started by reviewing old documents with a care that I never had before. Deeds, bank contracts, medical forms. Amid yellowed papers, I found subtle but revealing inconsistencies. Subscriptions on dates when I barely left the house. Authorizations that I did not remember having granted in that way. Nothing screamed immediate illegality, but everything pointed to a silent, calculated drive. That gave me a mixture of revolt and focus. I started to observe the telephone conversations more closely. Whenever they mentioned deadlines, I asked them to repeat them. Whenever they talked about getting it done soon, I pretended not to understand. They explained it again, in more detail, believing that they were helping me. And with each explanation, they let something more slip. It was impressive how the certainty that I was not at risk made them careless. My ally advised me to put everything away in an organized way. Nothing loose, nothing emotional. Dates, names, contradictory versions. I started to put together a folder that was not visible anywhere. That folder became my shield. Knowing that I had hard evidence made me sleep better, even in the midst of constant tension. I was no longer just resisting. I was building a defense. There was a moment when I got access to messages that shouldn't have reached me, conversations in which my name was treated as a problem, as an obstacle. There was no affection, no real concern, just strategy. Reading that hurt more than I expected. Even prepared, seeing the coldness written without disguises was like receiving a direct blow. I had to stop, breathe, compose myself before continuing, but I didn't look away. Each piece of evidence gathered strengthened something inside me. It wasn't just anger, it was conviction. The certainty that I was not wrong, exaggerating, or misinterpreting. That was real. And more importantly, it was defensible. For the first time, I seriously thought about the possibility of exposing everything. Not out of revenge, but out of necessity. If I didn't defend myself, I would be swallowed up by that narrative they were trying to impose. I started to wonder when the right time would be. It wasn't yet. The pieces needed to be complete. I needed to know exactly how far they had gone and how far they intended to go. Patience continued to be my greatest ally. Pretending was still part of the plan, but now with a clearer purpose. I knew what I was waiting for, and that made all the difference. My body started to respond differently as well. Anxiety no longer paralyzed me. It turned into an alert. I woke up tired, yes, but determined. Each day that I managed to advance a little more in the organization of the races was a small, silent victory. They didn't realize it, but I was ceasing to be reactive. I was getting ready to turn the tables on me. There was a night when I spread all the documents on the table and watched them in silence. That was the materialization of betrayal, but also of my resistance. Each roll represented their attempt to erase me, and each paper there, kept by me, represented proof that I was still present, lucid, and capable. That moved me in an unexpected way. I realized then that it was not just about winning a future legal dispute. It was about recovering my identity. They tried to reduce me to a condition, to a convenient label. But that evidence said otherwise. They said I had history, will, clarity, and that no one had the right to decide for me without my consent. At that point, I already knew that there would be no return. Even if everything was interrupted at that moment, something had broken forever. Confidence would not return. But, curiously, this no longer paralyzed me. I accepted the loss with more lucidity than pain. The priority now was different. It was to protect the woman I was becoming. I closed the folder, put everything away carefully, and turned off the light in the room. I sat in the dark for a few minutes, taking a deep breath. I knew the confrontation was approaching. I still didn't know exactly what it would be like, but I knew I was ready. Not ready emotionally, perhaps, but ready strategically. And that was something they never imagined when they decided to underestimate me. This is the hardest part to tell, because by revealing it, I give up the last layer of silence that still protected me. Talking about it means exposing choices, losses, and pains that I carried alone for a long time. If you have come this far, it is because you understand that some truths are too expensive to remain hidden. Subscribe to the channel, not as a support for me, but as a way to preserve voices like this, so they don't disappear when they need to be heard most. The confirmation of the deadline came too casually not to be calculated. In a seemingly harmless conversation, my son commented that soon everything would be resolved and that I would no longer have to worry about certain responsibilities. The way he spoke, almost relieved, made my stomach sink. It was not an assumption, it was a schedule. Something was already scheduled, organized, about to be executed. At that moment, I understood that time had ceased to be just a pressure factor. He had become a real threat. I spent the rest of the day with that phrase hammering in my head. Soon, vague words, but loaded with urgency. For the first time since it all began, I felt a more direct, almost physical fear. It was no longer about gathering evidence or observing behavior. It was about preventing something that was about to happen. If I took too long, if I miscalculated, I could wake up in a reality where my choices would no longer exist. This possibility left me in a constant state of alert. I talked to my ally that same night. For the first time, we are not talking about hypotheses, but about real deadlines. There were clear signs that a legal move was near. Meetings, documents in the final phase, more confident speeches. Everything indicated that they believed they were in the final stretch. This perception was harsh, but also enlightening. I needed to stop just preparing. I needed to decide when and how to act. The weight of the decision fell on me hard. If I advanced too early, I could expose my cards without securing sufficient protection. If he waited too long, he could lose everything. This tension accompanied me for days, taking away my sleep, tightening my chest. He walked around the house at night, thinking about every possible scenario, every consequence. I never imagined that I would have to calculate risks in this way within my own family. I began to notice subtle changes in their behavior. A greater haste, less patience for my questions, more attempts to reassure me. It was as if they wanted to keep me calm until the last minute. This false tranquility gave me goosebumps. The more they tried to convince me that everything was under control, the more I felt that something decisive was approaching. They no longer had the care they had before. Their confidence was turning into carelessness. My body felt the proximity of the impact even before my mind accepted it. I woke up with my heart racing, my thoughts racing ahead of the day. At times, I had to stop and take a deep breath so as not to panic. But strangely, along with fear came a harsh clarity. I knew exactly what was at stake. And knowing that, as scary as it was, also gave me focus. I started to review everything even more rigorously. Every test, every note, every detail needed to be in the right place. There was no margin for error. The feeling was that he was preparing to cross a narrow bridge, knowing that any misstep could be definitive. This awareness left me exhausted, but also strangely centered. I could no longer afford to falter. There was a moment when I thought about giving up everything, selling the house, moving away, accepting an intermediate solution just to have peace. This temptation lasted a few minutes. It was enough to remember the paper with my name, the word disability, printed without my consent. That was not peace. It was erasure. And I didn't survive everything I lived through to end up like this, reduced to a decision made by others. It was then that something inside me took hold for good. It was not courage in the romantic sense of the word. It was determination, a cold certainty that I would go all the way, even if it cost relationships, comfort, illusions. I could no longer pretend indefinitely. The deadline required action. And like it or not, I was ready to cross the line that separated silence from confrontation. At that point, I no longer cared about being seen as ungrateful, difficult, or exaggerated. These labels have lost their power. What mattered was to get out of that whole situation, with my autonomy preserved. I had proof. He was clear. He had support. The fear still existed, but it no longer controlled me. He walked beside me, not in front of me. That night, I sat alone and did something I hadn't done in a long time. I made a decision without asking anyone for approval. I decided that I would no longer expect to be pushed out of my own life. Their deadline would not be mine. I would choose the moment. And when he did, there would be no turning back. That decision marked a point of no return. The next time we met, nothing would be the same as before. As I turned off the lights in the house, I felt a mixture of fear and force run through my body. I knew the confrontation was near. I knew it would be tough, public, and definitive. But I also knew that I was no longer going to him as a victim. I was going prepared. And that changed everything. I accepted the invitation to the decisive meeting with a calmness that I did not even recognize. On the other end of the line, my son seemed satisfied, almost relieved. He said that it would be just a formality, that everything was on track, and that I could finally rest. That word, rest, sounded like a cruel euphemism. I knew it wasn't about rest, but about surrender. Still, I accepted. He said he would be there. And when I hung up, I felt something strange. It wasn't fear, it was readiness. In the days leading up to the meeting, I prepared myself in silence. I didn't just review documents, I reviewed myself. I observed my reactions, controlled impulses, organized thoughts. I couldn't get there as someone too wounded to speak clearly. It needed to be precise, objective. Every detail mattered. It wasn't just a family reunion, it was a carefully set stage, and I needed to go into it knowing exactly what role I was going to play. The night before, I hardly slept. Not out of anxiety, but out of awareness. My mind was alert, going over possible scenarios, answers, disqualification attempts. I knew they would try to interrupt me, confuse me, paint me as emotionally unstable. They had done this before. The difference now is that I was prepared. I wouldn't discuss feelings. I was going to present facts. And facts do not tremble. I arrived at the place before the agreed time, not out of nervousness, but out of strategy. I wanted to feel the environment, observe who would be present, understand the dynamics before everything started. When I saw some people I didn't expect, professionals, not family members, I had confirmation of what I already suspected. That was not a conversation. It was a procedure. And I was his object. Or at least, that's how they thought. My son greeted me with a rehearsed smile, one of those that do not reach the eyes. The daughter-in-law maintained her impeccable, confident, almost triumphant posture. They were confident. Too much. They believed that I was there to listen, accept, and sign. It was visible. They spoke to each other with familiarity, as if already celebrating an early victory. This confidence of theirs gave me something unexpected. Advantage. When the conversation began, I let them lead. I heard speeches about care, about the future, about security. The same words as always, now spoken with more formality. I nodded silently, observing every detail. They did not realize that as they spoke, they were in a hurry. Haste to conclude, to close, to close. Those who are in a hurry usually believe that the other no longer offers resistance. The time came when I was asked to speak. The silence that formed was heavy, almost solemn. I felt all eyes on me, evaluating, measuring, expecting a predictable reaction. I took a deep breath and started slowly. I didn't defend myself. I didn't attack. I just organized the facts, one by one. Dates, documents, phrases, contradictions. With each point presented, I felt the environment change. Their security was beginning to crack. I realized the exact moment when I stopped being underestimated. That's when they interrupted me, and I continued. Without raising your voice, without hesitation, I just kept going. That baffled them. The frail woman they had been waiting for was not there. In her place, there was someone centered, prepared, impossible to easily disqualify. I saw gazes cross. I saw the tension rise. The narrative they had built was beginning to crumble. It was not an explosive confrontation. It was something deeper. A slow, meticulous disassembly. Each piece of evidence presented took away a piece of their moral authority. Every question I asked required answers that didn't come, and when they came, they were insufficient. For the first time, it wasn't me who looked confused. It was them. And that completely changed the game. In the end, the silence that settled was different from all the others I had ever experienced. It was not a silence of exclusion, but of impact. I felt that something had turned there. It was not yet the end, but it was the beginning of the collapse of their plan. I left that meeting with my heart racing. Yes, but with my head held high. I had crossed the line, and from that moment on, nothing could be resolved without me being at the center of the decision. As I walked outside, I felt the weight of what I had done. There was no turning back. Relations were irreversibly wounded. But curiously, this no longer paralyzed me. I hadn't gone into that room to save ties. I went in to save myself, and that I had done. When I got home, I sat alone for a few minutes, in silence. The announced confrontation had taken place, not in the way they expected, nor in the way I feared. There was still a difficult road ahead, consequences to face, final decisions to be made. But one thing was clear. I was no longer the woman who accepted being pushed. The truth had been told, and now the world would have to deal with it. The hearing took place a few days later, and this time there was no more room for staging. The atmosphere was formal, cold, completely different from the rooms where everything had been planned on the sly. There, no one called me confused, nor did I try to soften words with false concern. Each sentence had weight. Each document needed to stand on its own, and I arrived prepared for it. I sat with my hands firmly on the table, feeling my heart beating strongly but regularly. It wasn't nervousness, it was concentration. I looked around and noticed something I had never seen before. My son avoided my gaze. The daughter-in-law maintained a rigid posture, but there was tension there, difficult to hide. For the first time, they did not control the environment. They couldn't control the pace, and they definitely didn't control the narrative anymore. When they gave me the floor, I didn't talk about hurts. I didn't talk about emotional betrayal. I spoke of facts, of documents signed without adequate explanation, of decisions made during my grief, of repeated attempts to question my lucidity without real medical basis. Each point was supported by evidence, records, dates. I saw, little by little, the story they told unravel before everyone. There were attempts to interrupt, cross-comments, hasty explanations. None of this worked. For the first time, I didn't have to defend myself emotionally. I just presented what existed. And what existed was enough. The silence that formed after each revelation was heavy, uncomfortable. Not for me, but for those who believed they could silence me with soft words and hidden papers. The most intense moment came when they questioned my ability. That which had been used against me for so long now needed to be publicly sustained, and it wasn't. There were no reports, there were no independent evaluations, there was nothing but convenient assumptions. I felt something inside me completely align in that instant. Everything they tried to use to diminish me turned out to be fragile in the light. I noticed the turn not in a specific phrase, but in the change in the air of the room. The attitude of those present has changed. The look of those who conducted the process ceased to be neutral and became attentive. The questions began to be directed at them, not me. For the first time since the beginning of everything, I was not the focus of distrust. They were. There was a moment when my son tried to explain intentions, to talk about care, about love, but it was too late. Intentions do not cancel actions, and actions had been clearly exposed. I listened to everything with a firm silence, without reacting, without provoking. I didn't need it anymore. The story spoke for itself, and that was liberating in a way that I had never experienced. When the preliminary decision was announced, I felt a huge weight leave my shoulders. Their plan was suspended, annulled until further evaluation. Nothing else could move forward without my clear and recorded consent. That simple sentence had a profound impact. It was the formal recognition of what I had been struggling to prove. I was lucid. I was in control. I existed. I didn't celebrate. He doesn't smile. I just took a deep breath. The victory at that moment did not taste of joy but of relief. A dense relief, almost tired. I looked forward, not at them. I didn't need it anymore. The confrontation had happened, not in shouts, but in truth. And the truth had won. As I left the building, I felt the sun on my face in a different way. It was not euphoria. It was consciousness. Nothing would ever be the same again. Relations were broken, perhaps forever. But I was whole. I walked slowly to the car, feeling each step as a silent confirmation that I had crossed something too big to ignore. On the way back, I thought about all that I had lost and all that I had preserved. I lost the illusion of family protection. I lost my emotional innocence. But I preserved my autonomy, my dignity, my voice. That exchange, as painful as it was, had a deep meaning. I had not been spared the pain, but I had been spared the erasure. When I got home, I sat alone in the living room and let the silence envelop me. For the first time, he carried no threat. It carried closure. The turning point had happened, not just in the process, but within me. I no longer saw myself as someone who survived by luck. I had survived by choice, strategy, and quiet courage. There were still consequences ahead, difficult conversations, irreparable distances. But I knew, with quiet clarity, that no one else would make decisions about me without me being there. That certainty, built with great difficulty, was the true triumph. And as night fell outside, I realized that something essential had been recovered. Myself. The consequences did not come as an immediate bang, but as a prolonged silence. In the days following the decision, no one cared. No message, no request to talk. The distancing was total, almost clinical. I expected some kind of reaction, maybe anger, maybe a hasty attempt at reconciliation. None of that came of it. And curiously, this emptiness confirmed much of what I had already understood. When control ends, interest also ends. My son tried to contact me only once, through a short message, without emotion, without apology. He spoke of misunderstandings, of overzealousness, of things that got out of control. I read and reread those words, trying to find real responsibility. I didn't find it. It was another attempt to rewrite history, now without power. I didn't respond immediately. For the first time, I was the one who chose the time. The daughter-in-law did not try to contact her. Her silence was more revealing than any speech. There was no regret there, only calculation. I realized that some people don't deal well with losing advantage. Accepting the mistake would require something she clearly wasn't willing to offer. And accepting this, as hard as it was also part of the liberation process. Not every breakup needs to be explained to be definitive. The consequences also came in the form of external looks. People who had previously treated me with condescension began to look at me with cautious respect. Others avoided contact, perhaps out of discomfort, perhaps because they believed the wrong version for too long. I didn't make a point of confronting anyone. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Whoever wanted to understand would understand. Those who did not want to would stay away. Inside me, the impact was deep and silent. There were days when loneliness weighed more heavily than before. Not physical loneliness, but the absence of the idea of family as shelter. This loss hurt more than I expected. At the same time, there was a strange peace growing. A peace that came from the coherence between what I felt and what I did. I was no longer cheating on myself to maintain bonds. I had to relearn how to occupy my own days. Small routines have taken on new meaning. Make simple decisions without consulting anyone. Organize the house in my own way. Plan the future without interference. All this, which once seemed trivial, was now a symbol of recovered autonomy. Every everyday choice was a silent affirmation that I was still in charge of my life. There were moments of guilt, questions that arose at night, when fatigue let its guard down. Could I have done it differently? Was I too harsh? These doubts came, but they did not stay. It was enough to remember the paper, the plan, the calculated silence. I didn't cause that rupture. I just refused to be erased. This memory always put things in place. The legal consequences were also clear. Limits were established, distances formalized. Everything that was once nebulous now has defined contours. And while that made the relationship even colder, it also made her safe. I no longer lived under veiled threat. There were no more secret meetings, no more invisible decisions. This predictability, even harsh, brought relief. Over time, I realized that I no longer felt the need to justify my choice. In the beginning, there was an almost automatic desire to explain. to be understood. This need has been disappearing. Not all breakups need consensus to be legitimate. I had done what needed to be done. The rest was not under my control, and accepting that was also liberating. The woman who left that process was not the same as the one who entered. I hadn't become cold, but I had become lucid. I learned to recognize limits, to be suspicious of overzealousness, to value my own perception. This transformation did not come without scars, but each scar carried learning. I no longer confused love with obedience, nor care with control. By the end of that phase, it was clear that the consequences were not just losses. They were redefinitions of bonds, of expectations, of identity. I had not won in the traditional sense. I had gone through something that cost me dearly, but it had come out in one piece. And that, at that point in my life, was everything. Life has not returned to what it was before. And over time, I realized that I shouldn't even have. That version of me, which trusted without question and accepted other people's decisions to preserve harmony, no longer existed. In her place, there was someone quieter, firmer, more attentive. It was not bitterness. It was consciousness. I had gone through something that changed me from the inside, and denying it would be a new form of betrayal of myself. Rebuilding life was not a grandiose gesture. It was a daily process. It started with small choices, reorganizing documents, redefining boundaries, deciding who would have access to me. I started to value my time in a way I had never done before. I learned to say no without explaining too much. I learned to listen to my intuition without asking permission. Each step was simple, but loaded with meaning. There were days of intense loneliness. Not physical loneliness, but the one that comes when an old emotional structure is broken. At times, I missed the idea of family, not the people themselves. It hurt to accept that that bond was no longer secure or honest, but at the same time, there was a deep relief in no longer having to pretend, in no longer having to shrink to fit into other people's expectations. I started to surround myself with few people, but real ones. Relationships where I didn't need to prove lucidity, nor justify decisions, where my age was not seen as fragility, but as experience. These new connections did not erase the past, but they helped me build a more solid present. I was no longer looking for approval. He sought respect, and that made all the difference. Contact with my son became distant, protocol. There was no full reconciliation, only a cold, limited coexistence, possible within the new limits. It hurt to accept this, but no more than it hurt to almost lose myself. I understood that some relationships are not rebuilt, they are transformed. And insisting on what has already broken only prolongs the wound. Over time, I realized that my posture changed even physically. She walked more upright, spoke more clearly, maintained silences without guilt. People started to look at me in a different way. Not because I was looking for it, but because something in me had become non-negotiable. I was no longer available to be diminished. This presence, firm and calm, was the result of everything I went through. I didn't become harsh in the sense of insensitive. I kept feeling, getting emotional, remembering, but there was something new there, an internal structure that didn't break easily. I had learned that dignity is not asked for, it is sustained, that love does not require erasure, that aging is not losing value, it is gaining depth. Sometimes I still think about how everything could have been different. These reflections come, but they do not dominate me. I did what I needed to do with the tools I had at that time. I survived, I repositioned myself, I rebuilt myself. It was not a happy ending in the classic sense. It was an honest ending, and that, for me, is worth much more. Today, when I look back, I don't just see betrayal. I see a late but powerful awakening. I see the woman who was almost silenced, and the woman who chose not to disappear. This trajectory did not leave me intact, but it left me whole, and that's what matters. I am no longer the underestimated woman who entered that house in silence. I am someone who knows your limits, your strength, and your value. I didn't have to shout to prove anything. I just remained. And in the end, that's what saved me. I haven't gone back to who I was before. I became something new, more aware, firmer, a woman of steel. If this story touched something in you, share this video. Not because it is my story, but because it reveals patterns that repeat themselves in silence in many families and power relations. By sharing, you can reach someone who needs to hear it right now. Turning that gesture into an act of solidarity is like breaking a cycle that shouldn't continue. I'll stay here, reading each comment carefully. Tell me, from which city or country are you watching? And what about this story stayed with you? His words are not lost here. They really reach me.